let's talk about seed oils, because I think this is the next segue. Sure. And I think this is another place where we disagree pretty significantly. So I've heard you say on other podcasts that seed oils are not bad for humans, and there's no evidence that seed oils are harmful for humans. And so I want to show, you've said publicly, like, show me a human trial that shows that seed oils are bad for humans. And by seed oils, we're really talking about linoleic acid. So I want to show my contention of multiple human trials, and I'm not going to show any of the ones you don't like. We're not going to get into Minnesota or Sydney or any of these other, we're not going to do any of those trials. I'm going to show you other trials, right? Because all that discussion has been done before. Tucker Goodrich, like, we've debated with people on this in the past. I don't think it's worth arguing over the validity of Minnesota Coronary, Sydney Diet Heart, LA Veterans, the margarine trial. I want to show you other studies that you may or may not have seen that will suggest that in humans, linoleic acid and seed oils containing linoleic acid are problematic. If you look at the literature, there's evidence that there's increased LDL oxidation when there's increased seed oils, increased linoleic acid. So we've already talked about linoleic acid, LDL oxidation, and the idea that oxidation of LDL in the subendothelial space is probably a very bad thing. So in the Jerusalem nutrition study, people that were eating more seed oils had more LDL oxidation. We know that when more linoleic acid is consumed, there's increased LA breakdown products. So there's increased 4-HNE, 9 and 13 HODs. When less linoleic acid is consumed, there's less linoleic acid breakdown products. And we know that when there's more linoleic acid in the LDL particle, that particle is more susceptible to oxidation. Increased saturated fat, the fat that raises LDL, which the mainstream believes causes cardiovascular disease, will decrease Lp(a), a very strong risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Decreased saturated fat and increased linoleic acid will increase Lp(a) and will increase oxidized LDL. So increased linoleic acid decreases male hormones. That's testosterone and testosterone byproducts. I'll show that. There's a study in humans showing that soybean oil consumption increases Lp(PLA2). So lipoprotein phospholipase A2 is a particle that's associated with LDL that is involved in cleaving oxidized phospholipids in LDL. So that's probably not a good thing if you're increasing Lp(PLA2). We know that in people, this is observational, there's a strong, consistent correlation between linoleic acid consumption and macular degeneration. And we know that in mothers who are breastfeeding, the LA content, so the linoleic acid content of the breast milk, correlates negatively with motor and cognitive skills in kids. The last piece of this is that in studies that look at linoleic acid, and this is probably why linoleic acid is so confusing, consistently researchers are looking at serum levels of linoleic acid, when in fact the only seriously good metric that will reflect linoleic acid consumption in the diet is adipose tissue linoleic acid. I know there was a large study that you posted on Twitter looking at linoleic acid in the human diet and cardiovascular disease. And I can show that study if you want. I have the reference. Unfortunately, if you look at that study, of all the studies they looked at, only 1 or 2, maybe 3 max looked at adipose tissues of linoleic acid. And in none of those studies was there any significant association between adipose linoleic acid and improved cardiovascular outcomes, meaning more linoleic acid improves cardiovascular outcomes. And there are studies that show increased linoleic acid in the adipose tissue and worse cardiovascular outcomes. So this whole linoleic acid thing and the whole seed oil thing is very complicated and really interesting, because ultimately what you find is that if you're eating saturated fat from steak or butter, you're going to have more LDL, but you're also going to have less Lp(a) and less oxidized LDL. And if you eat seed oils, you're going to have less LDL. But I think that the cardiology community is missing the fact that you have increased Lp(a), and I can show you studies to corroborate any of these or all of these assertions. I'll show a couple just to show them in a moment. You're going to have increased Lp(a) and increased oxidized LDL. So we are missing the boat in a big way when it comes to saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat. So let me just show a couple of studies to corroborate all of those things I said. So let's start with, here is a study in humans, decreasing saturated fat and increasing seed oils, increasing linoleic acid, increases oxidized LDL and Lp(a). So I don't think there are any cardiologists out there who would say that increasing oxidized LDL and increasing Lp(a) is a good thing. So saturated fat intake decreased, polyunsaturated fat increased, and they say alterations in dietary fat resulted in increased plasma concentrations of Lp(a) and oxidized LDL. So this is a study in humans showing inflammation. I believe that you could say that Lp(a) and oxidized LDL are indicators of inflammation. And these are bad cardiovascular outcomes with the seed oils. And I'll show a couple others just to corroborate this. We can go back to any of these if you want. So let's look at this one. linoleic acid in the breast milk in kids. This one is particularly scary because I think that it's really dangerous to think about mothers eating too much linoleic acid and the way that it would affect their children. So, title of this study is The Association Between Linoleic Acid Levels in Colostrum in Humans and Child Cognition at 2 and 3 Years in the Eating Cohort. So, this is an article. Again, you were saying, show me articles in humans that seed oils or linoleic acid are bad. Our findings suggest that too high levels of linoleic acid in the colostrum are associated with poorer child development at 2 and 3 years. I want to show one more study. Again, I can show studies for all of the points that I just said. Let's look at the male sex hormones here as well. Diet and sex hormones in healthy men. If you look at this study, you'll find that with the inclusion of seed oils, increased linoleic acid, you see decreases in male sex hormones. Whether you're a man or a woman, you don't want that. I'm happy to show macular degeneration. I'm happy to show increased oxidized LDL with linoleic acid. I'm happy to show lowering linoleic. Actually, let me show this one because it's so important. So lowering dietary linoleic acid decreases oxidized linoleic acid metabolites in humans. These are things like 9 and 13 HOD. These are not associated with good outcomes. So it's pretty clear, I think, in humans that when we eat more linoleic acid as more seed oils, things like corn, canola, sunflower, safflower, soybean, peanut, we're going to accumulate that linoleic acid in our adipose tissue. That's the only real indicator of how much linoleic acid we've consumed. We're also going to accumulate that linoleic acid in our LDL particles. And I can show an article or multiple articles clearly showing that LDL enriched in linoleic acid is more likely to be oxidized into the subendothelial space. So wrapping all of this back around, and I appreciate you letting me talk about all this. There'll be a lot for you to respond to, and I'll give you the floor in a moment. Wrapping all this back around, when we have LDL in the subintimal space, that LDL that's enriched in linoleic acid because people are eating seed oils is more like a bomb. That LDL is much more likely to become oxidized by the macrophage environment, more likely to become oxidized LDL. One thing that I didn't mention earlier in this podcast that I probably should have is that Brown and Goldstein many years ago clearly showed that macrophages don't take up native LDL in the subendothelial space. They only take up oxidized LDL. And so, again, I don't understand why LDL is a target and not oxidized LDL or things that increase the oxidation propensity of LDL. Those seem like the real problems here rather than LDL itself, when macrophages won't even take up native LDL. So, and if you want to show the study that you have that's showing linoleic acid is not bad for cardiovascular, I can show it. I have it as well, but we can talk about the adipose tissue and why I don't think that study is terribly compelling. So with all of that in mind, why in the world, my friend, and I feel like we're friends after this so far.
We are friends.
Why in the world, my friend, would you recommend that people eat seed oils and not just eat butter? I mean, you and I have to have a steak after this. Come on.
I will be more than happy. Look, so let me just tell you, I am not a vegan or a vegetarian. I love ribeyes. I make them myself. I'm a food snob. I even have a cookbook that includes food. I don't mind putting butter on my steak. I don't eat it every day, but I'm not one of these. But also my LDL is 46. So either way,
wait,
just to get back to it. And
you take meds?
I do. I take Zetia and Crestor.
Okay.
It's 41 and 46, ApoB and LDL.
Okay, so you're taking medications to lower your LDL. That's just, we need to be transparent about that.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's not a problem. All my folks know this. But yeah, we are friends. I mean, people who are watching this, I don't want you guys to think we're having a fight or an argument here. We're all friends here. We all have the same goals in mind. Everybody who works in healthcare is trying to help people get healthier. We may reach different conclusions. We might reach different ways of achieving the same goals, which is fine. At the end of the day, I think our intentions are both to help people get better. I know I've talked to Paul before this. We both have that same goal in mind. The study that I usually cite, which I feel is the most conclusive, was a 2019 Circulation publication.
Let me pull it up.
They had 68,000 participants.
Let me pull it up so we have it. Hold on one sec.
Yeah, fine. Well, let me just bring it up. You can pull it up, but let me keep talking. Does that work? So they had 68,000 participants in this trial. They followed most of them anywhere from 2 to 31.9 years. The end points were reached 15,000 times. They had 76,000 fatty acid measurements. So they actually biopsied and, did testing on the people. They had 76,000 samples.
Well,
you can respond in a second. And ultimately, the conclusion of this almost 70,000 person, 76,000, biopsy study was that seed oils or whatever, however you want to measure linoleic acid, it was actually more specific, had a reduction in CV mortality and strokes. Now we know that consumption of seed oils has gone up. It's a cheap oil. Of course, it's easy to make. And we've had, since that happened, like that was the 1960s, since the 1960s until now, we've had a 60% reduction in cardiovascular deaths. You may argue it's the medications or the stent technology, what have you.
But
that's fine.
We have increasing morbidity. So
I know, but just let me just talk too, and then you can jump in. The linoleic acid that we found has been shown to reduce total cholesterol and LDL. Now, this is especially true in most studies, and you said this too. When you take saturated fat and substitute it out for any PUFA or MUFA, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fatty acids, you do get reduced LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, and improved outcomes. Now, look, I'm not like married to seed oils. I don't even know how I got wrapped up into this seed oil business. I love olive oil, fresh, cold pressed, extra virgin olive oil. That's what we use. I came from a Mediterranean part of the world. My grandparents and my dad actually grew up on an olive tree farm. The olives from there and the oil that they made was amazing and fantastic. That's what I grew up consuming, and that's what I recommend to most of my patients. But not everyone can afford like the highest level of olive oil. If you substitute it for any vegetable oil, it would be fine. The vast majority of people, if they're downing like sticks and sticks of butter every day, that's going to be a problem. No one is telling you to do that. You can eat a little bit here and there, not a big deal.
I'm telling him to do that.
I know. Yeah, I know your stance. But if you switch butter out to anything, like whether it's olive or safflower, canola, whatever, I don't care which one it is, anything that's unsaturated, polyunsaturated, mono, you see improved outcomes. Literally every study has done that. But this was just the biggest study that was done on linoleic acid with tissue biopsies, tissue samples, and what have you.
Yeah. So if you actually look at the study carefully and you look at the ones that they included, and I'm trying to pull up the study so I can show people, there were very, very few tissue biopsies. So adipose tissue linoleic acid is the only accurate measure of linoleic acid in the human body. And I'll talk about why. And so of all the studies they included in this, only 2 or 3 of the potentially 30 plus studies looked at adipose tissue linoleic acid. And in those 3 studies, there was no correlation. There was no protective benefit of linoleic acid for cardiovascular disease.
You were saying something about the tissue biopsy, the 76,000 tissue biopsies. What were you saying?
There were not 76,000 tissue biopsies in the study. There were only
that's what they said.
There were only 3 studies of all the studies they considered that were adipose tissue linoleic acid. The majority of studies in this reference are looking at linoleic acid levels in the serum. And the reason linoleic acid levels in the serum are not accurate is because lower levels of linoleic acid can be found in people with increased levels of cardiovascular disease when that linoleic acid is oxidized into oxlams, oxidized products of linoleic acid metabolism, 4-HNE, 9 and 13 HOD. And so if you really want to understand how much linoleic acid someone is eating, you must look at adipose LA. And of all the studies they considered in this one, only 3 looked at adipose linoleic acid. And of those 3, there was no protective benefit of linoleic acid when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So this is an error of human physiology that is so often made in linoleic acid literature that you cannot look at serum levels of linoleic acid. You must look at adipose tissue linoleic acid. And as I said, there are studies, there's one that I can show if you want, that shows more linoleic acid in the adipose tissue, worse cardiovascular disease. And so I think that again,
you
the Western medical system, let me finish this one. The Western medical system is missing the mark here. Even though this is a big study with lots of patient outcomes, they're looking at the wrong markers. You can't use serum linoleic acid. You have to use adipose tissue linoleic acid. That's what you have to use. And this study didn't use that. And they didn't do 76,000 biopsies of people's adipose tissue. There were only 3 studies of all of them that had the actual level of adipose tissue LA. They were mostly looking at serum linoleic acid, which is inaccurate, as I said. It doesn't reflect linoleic acid consumption. We know that. That's been shown over and over and over. That's human physiology. We know that linoleic acid can be metabolized into all sorts of things, arachidonic acid. And oftentimes, if you have more linoleic acid in your blood, it means that you don't have inflammation because that linoleic acid is not going down that omega-6 pathway. So this linoleic acid in the blood is a very mushy, very inaccurate measure of linoleic acid consumption. So this is where I think we go wrong. Did you want to respond to what about all those things that I showed you about more linoleic acid, increased oxidized LDL, more linoleic acid, increased LP little a, more linoleic acid, worse child development, more linoleic acid, worse male hormones,
I mean,
more linoleic acid. It's endless. Like how do you account for all of those?
like a lot of those were, like 309 children, like, little small studies and measurements, which it doesn't matter. Like, I'm not like the defender of seed oils. I really don't care that much about it. I recommend for people to use olive oil, and I'm sure you do too, or butter, or what have you. I don't, I'm not a, huge advocate for butter, obviously. But, when you look at the totality of this one study, and this is the biggest, largest human study on this, they had 76,000 fatty acid measurements, and I didn't look to see if they're adipose tissue versus muscle, because I know some of them were muscle biopsies. There was some of them that were muscle biopsies, because I remember I did look at some of those. But either way, you can't argue with the outcomes. They had less cardiovascular disease, less cardiovascular mortality, and and CVA strokes. And their conclusion was that switching from saturated fat to any seed oil, whether, especially in this one, it was linoleic acid specifically, is cardioprotective. I mean, that was literally the outcome that they came up with. And we've seen over time with multiple studies that anytime you switch from a more saturated fat, I mean, like the line between saturated fat and cardiovascular death is a straight line.
No, it's not.
I don't think we are. I mean,
no,
we're not arguing that.
You've said that.
You've said that on multiple podcasts yourself.
I'm definitely going to argue with you on that. The line between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease is a straight line. There's so many studies that come out. We just talked about earlier in this podcast.
It's exactly like this.
We talked about in this podcast, all this recent meta-analysis with saturated fat and butter. How do you account for the total allowance, the catavins?
Let me. So here's the thing. If the problem with saturated fat is it's on a sigmoidal curve. And I'll send you the studies if you want. But if you take saturated fat intakes of 30% of total calories and reduce it to 12%, you're not going to see a decrease in cardiovascular mortality, cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular anything, all-cause mortality, nothing. Because it's not enough. You haven't crossed the threshold. And there are studies that are published like that they're in JACC. They're in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. There's a recent study in October 2019. It was like, saturated fat is not a concern anymore because look at this study. We reduced saturated fat intake from 20% down to 18, or like from 30 down to 15, and nothing happened. And we also know on the other side of the curve, saturated fat intakes below about 7%, there's no change in outcomes. If you go from 7% down to 3%, which is impossible to do, but you can, it's very difficult to show a reduction in cardiovascular mortality or what have you. But somewhere around the 8% mark, you have like this inflection point. Oops, the microphone. You have an inflection point where everything goes up. Like you have, 0 to about 6-7%, no change. Huge inflection point to about 10%, and then everything above 10% is a flat line. So there's that. There's the Finland trial, or the North Karelia, Finland, where they had the highest mortality rates in the 1970s. Cardiovascular mortality in North Karelia, Finland, there was 700 people dying for every 100,000 people. So the country said, hey, what's going on here? Let's fix this. They sent out a bunch of educators to this one little urban town up in North Karelia, northern Finland, and they looked at everything they're doing, and these were like rural people, tons of butter, tons of milk, tons of fat, steak, what have you. And they said, all right, you guys got to quit smoking. We got to try to lose some weight, and we're going to get your blood pressures down because they had really high blood pressures, and we're going to cut saturated fat intake. So they took their saturated fat intake down from 23% down to like 10 or something like, somewhere around 10%. They had an 84% reduction in overall mortality over the next, decade or two, and it's still ongoing. They attributed 40% of that to the reduction in saturated fat intake and 20% of that to the reduction in blood pressure. More people actually got overweight. Obesity rates went up, and smoking rates came down a little. Then in women went up a little, and then like dipped a little and have been going down. But people are like vaping and doing other things. But either way, I think the evidence for saturated fat in light of all that, and you said it on one of your own podcasts that, we're not arguing saturated fat doesn't raise your LDL. Absolutely it does. No question.
That's not what I'm saying.
I think that, well, what are you saying? Tell me.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like saturated fat doesn't raise your LDL. I'm not arguing that saturated fat doesn't raise your LDL. What I'm arguing is that saturated fat, while it raises your LDL, decreases your oxidized LDL, decreases your Lp(a). I think it's kind of shady to look at a Finland study where they had 4 interventions and they're trying to get people to lose weight, exercise more, decrease smoking, and lower saturated fat, and try and use fancy statistics to tell me that one of those is better or worse. There are free living populations of people all over the world. I'll show you these studies, Tokelauans, Catavans, Polynesian Islanders, who have huge amounts of saturated fat in their diet. This is the Stefan Lindeberg work, and essentially no evidence of vascular disease. So there are hundreds of thousands of people, natural experiments all over the world. There's no evidence that saturated fat is bad for humans. It's something we would have eaten evolutionarily.
But
That doesn't make any
isolated
sense to me.
societies, like if somebody's on an island and they've, evolved to eat what they have available to them, that's a different story. But like people in America and Europe maybe did not evolve those genetics, and there was no survivorship bias or what have you. So they don't have the ability to eat that way. I'm sure there are these weird little pockets of people that can eat a certain way.
It's
But
a
regardless,
hypothesis, but I think that that's unlikely.
I mean, how else do you explain, how else do you explain the direct line between saturated fat and death? I mean, cardiovascular death.
Where is there a direct line between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease? Wait. I need to go. We need to dig into the saturated fat a little bit. Let me show the butter and saturated fat study. So this is something we talked about this earlier in the podcast, and you did not disagree with this. So if you disagree with this now, I need to show this. So a systematic review, meta-analysis of butter consumption.
Butter is different than milk.
Well, butter is full of saturated fat, and the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes,
but for whatever reason, dairy milk and fermented certain cheeses in women, for example, were shown to be either neutral or slightly cardioprotective, but not butter. I mean, that's not one of them.
It's right there. It's in this study. Meta-analysis of butter consumption, risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and total mortality. Right there. Look at the conclusion.
But Paul, we can't just look at the title of a study that it looks like an N of 9 or what have you.
Systematic review, meta-analysis.
Nine participants. Paul,
this is a meta-analysis. 9 databases. It's not 9 participants. This is 9 databases. 6.5 million person years.
Well, you're scrolling through fast. But either way, I mean, you can find a study to prove like almost anything you want. I mean, and we can disagree that you want to follow these studies. I'll follow these other ones. No big deal. We can agree for that. But look, I could design a study that shows there's nothing bad happens when you reduce saturated fat intake or increase it. I mean, it's super easy. I just say you're eating saturated fat at 12% of total calories, increase it up to 50,000, no change. Like that's easy to do. We know that. You could argue the same thing, that this depends on what part of the curve you're on. But the American Heart Association and all the studies show that below 5% of total calories is the most protective. You have the least amount of cardiovascular outcomes, death, mortality, strokes, what have you.
Okay, so this is a really important point that I think we need to talk about so people don't get confused. This is where I think totality of the evidence is misleading. So really, this should be a 12-hour podcast. And I think that at this point, we've talked about almost everything we want to talk about, so we'll wrap it up soon. But when you say things like the AHA says saturated fat is associated with cardiovascular mortality, I know that nested in that statement is a lot of epidemiology, right? And these are observational studies. And so we'd have to go through all of those and say, well, why are you looking at this study? And what do you think about the potential that this study is confounded by healthy user bias and unhealthy user bias? And so that's why I think that when we're looking at these, we can say, look, you can potentially find studies on both sides of the equation. To me, that suggests not that you take a step back and you do something like saying, we need to look at the totality of the evidence. It means you take a step forward and you need to look at details and say, how much could this study have been confounded by healthy user bias and unhealthy user bias? And we know that with saturated fat, that is strongly at play, because for the last 70 years, since good old Ansel Keys, the healthy people have been avoiding saturated fat and the unhealthy people are riding motorcycles, smoking, shooting guns, and eating saturated fat and butter. So there's a lot of unhealthy behaviors. When was the last time you were at a regular barbecue? And you may not go to these. I don't go to these either. But I'm asking people to think about 4th of July in your hometown. You go to like a regular barbecue. How often does somebody eat just butter or just red meat? No, you're eating butter with seed oils and bread and brownies and processed sugar and high fructose corn syrup and Coca-Cola with caramel color. And so all of these associations get very, very sticky. And so when you say things like saturated fat clearly associated with cardiovascular disease, and I can show you a huge meta-analysis of 6.5 million person years showing that saturated fat in dairy is actually potentially cardioprotective. To me, this says you don't take a step back, you take a step forward, and you look at the details here. And then I can find free living populations of people who are having tons of saturated fat and don't have any problems. The Hadza, essentially no cardiovascular disease. And I went and I stayed with them, the Tokolawans, Katavans. And so I think we have to be better than this for our patients. We have to think about these things and think, okay, there's a lot of conflicting evidence here. What is the quality of each individual study? And what are we saying? What have humans done evolutionarily is not by any means the end all and be all, but I think it helps give a framework of what we're talking about, because I think it makes sense. And people would debate me on this, that what we've done evolutionarily is probably something that is reasonably good for humans. People would say, oh, no. But if I look at any free living population of humans, indigenous people, I consistently find massively lower rates of cardiovascular disease and chronic disease and diabetes. They're essentially vanishingly rare. So what are they doing differently than us? That, I think, is a clue to what we should be doing. It's not the end all and be all, but it's a clue. It's a thread that we should pull on. When we pull on that thread, what we find is they're eating meat. They're eating organs. A lot of them, like the Maasai or the Samburu, they're milking cows. They're eating dairy fat. They're eating honey. They're eating sugar. They're not eating seed oils. And who knows? I'm just saying that's the thread that I pull on and go, maybe we need to think about these things more carefully. And then when I zoom in, when I look at these studies carefully, I find inconsistencies like adipose tissue linoleic acid versus serum levels of linoleic acid, like LDL stratified for any metric of insulin resistance looks completely different than not. This is all the stuff that I think you need to zoom in and not zoom out. This is where the totality of evidence gets us in big trouble. And I think that it misleads us in terms of our thinking about these things. I mean, how can you ignore all of these interventional studies, not observational studies that I showed you? More linoleic acid, less saturated fat, more oxidized LDL, more LP little a. I mean, I just enumerated multiple studies in humans, more oxidized LDL, more cardiovascular disease, more linoleic acid in the human diet, more linoleic acid in the LDL, more likely to get oxidized. I don't know what else there is to say other than the fact that if there are studies like your ones you're showing that say linoleic acid is beneficial for cardiovascular disease, we need to zoom in and look at the details. The devil's in the details, not zoom out and say totality of evidence, because it's just, when you look at the details, what I see, and this is why I appreciate your perspective too, because I want more perspectives here. What I see is not consistent. It doesn't look like linoleic acid is cardioprotective. And I would assert that linoleic acid is potentially the worst thing that we could do for our patients by making their LDL more likely to oxidize, more LP little a, worsening male hormones, worsening outcomes in kids when they're getting more linoleic acid from breast milk. All these things, big problems for humans. And it wraps into the whole LDL discussion. So I think it's a beautiful kind of framework for the whole thing we've talked about.